The grand hall, a tapestry woven from whispers of old money and hushed ambition, shimmered under the crystalline glow of its antique chandeliers. Tonight, as on countless other nights, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged oak, and the faint, melancholic echo of a cello. Amidst this shimmering tableau of privilege and artistry stood Elias, a figure often overlooked, almost deliberately so, his broad frame a stoic sentinel by the velvet ropes, his uniform a muted olive against the vibrant silks and sharp tuxedos that flowed around him. Yet, beneath the stoop of his shoulders, under the watchful gaze that held a lifetime of quiet observation, pulsed a secret current, a river of unspoken melodies that longed for release. And tonight, by some strange twist of fate or cruel design, the river would finally break its banks, transforming not just Elias, but the very hearts that had once dismissed him. Chapter 1. Elias had been a fixture at the Gilded Lyre for what felt like an eternity, though the calendar only marked 7 years. 7 years of standing, observing, and silently guarding the treasures within these hallowed walls. Not just the priceless art, but the fragile peace of patrons, the delicate balance of an evening meant for refinement. His suit, a sturdy, slightly worn fabric, bore the subtle creases of countless shifts, a testament to his unwavering presence. It was, he often mused, his second skin, a uniform that both concealed and defined him. He was Elias, the security guard, a man whose physical form, solid, ungraceful, a little ponderous, seemed to speak volumes about his station in life. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a measured rhythm born of long hours on his feet, and a deeper internal weariness that no amount of rest could truly assuage. His mornings began long before the first rays of dawn kissed the chipped windows of his small, sparsely furnished apartment on the far side of the city. The clang of the antique coffee maker, the bitter aroma filling the tiny kitchen, was his ritualistic awakening. He'd sit at a chipped wooden table, tracing the faint patterns on its surface, sipping the lukewarm coffee, and letting his mind drift. It was in these quiet moments that the echoes of a different life would surface, faint at first, then growing louder, like a forgotten melody attempting to reclaim its harmony. A life where his hands, now calloused from years of gripping a flashlight and turning keys, had once danced across ivory keys, coaxing forth symphonies from the soul. The bus ride to the Gilded Lyre was a journey not just across the city, but across social strata. Each stop peeled away another layer of the ordinary, depositing him closer to a world he only served, never truly inhabited. As he approached the grand entrance, the ornate stonework, the polished brass, the very air seemed to hum with an exclusivity that was palpable. He'd adjust his tie, straighten his shoulders, and step into his role, leaving the dusty memories of his past at the threshold. Julian Thorne, on the other hand, inhabited this world as if born of its very gilded essence. He was the scion of the Thorne family, whose philanthropic legacy had endowed the Gilded Lyre with much of its splendor, and whose family name was practically etched into its foundation stones. Julian was younger than Elias by a good 2 decades, perhaps more, but carried himself with an arrogant assurance that suggested an eternal birthright. Tonight, he was holding court near a towering marble statue, a glass of amber liquid glinting in his hand as he regaled a small circle of admiring peers. His laughter, sharp and a little too loud, often cut through the polite murmur of the hall, a jarring counterpoint to its cultivated serenity. Elias had learned to predict Julian's movements, his sneering remarks, the way his eyes would often flick to Elias with a dismissive glint, as if to confirm the guard's permanent place as part of the hall's inanimate furniture. There was a particular sting in Julian's casual cruelty, a way he could make Elias feel not just invisible, but profoundly insignificant. It was not just the verbal jabs, but the unspoken judgment in his gaze, a complete lack of regard for the silent dignity Elias tried to maintain. Tonight, the triggering event began subtly. A celebrated mezzo-soprano had just finished a stirring performance, her voice a velvet ribbon weaving through the air. The applause was thunderous, an ocean of appreciation. Elias, standing by the exit, allowed himself a small, private moment of appreciation. Music, even heard from the periphery, had a way of reaching into the forgotten corners of his being. As the crowd began to disperse, Julian and his entourage lingered. "Another triumph, wouldn't you say, darling?" Julian purred to a woman draped in emerald silk. His eyes, however, were fixed on Elias. Though one wonders if some people truly appreciate the finer things, or if they merely see them as an assignment. Elias pretended not to hear, his gaze fixed on a distant point, a familiar shield against the barbs. But Julian wasn't finished. He sauntered closer, his smile a thin, predatory line. "Tell me, God," he began, his voice dropping just enough to ensure only his companions and Elias could hear, "do you ever feel a pang of envy, watching these artists, these patrons, living lives of passion and beauty, while you stand there, a pillar of, shall we say, immovable utility?" His gaze swept Elias's body, lingering on the slight heft around his middle, the gentle curve of his shoulders, implying a heaviness not just of body, but of spirit. The woman in emerald silk offered a delicate, stifled giggle. The words, though cloaked in a veneer of sophisticated inquiry, landed like small, sharp stones. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a sensation he'd grown accustomed to. He simply offered a curt, professional nod. "My duty is to ensure the safety and order of the premises, sir." Julian chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine warmth. "Of course. And you do it with such robust dedication. One might even call it a talent in its own way. A talent for blending into the background, perhaps." He winked at his friends, who returned his mirth with knowing smiles. The woman in emerald silk giggled again, this time a little louder. The insult, delivered with such effortless grace, seemed to hang in the air, a poisonous bloom. Elias felt the familiar rush of heat to his face, the quiet humiliation that always accompanied these encounters. It was a familiar ritual, one that gnawed at the edges of his hard-won peace. Chapter 2. The incident with Julian was a small cut, but it festered, as all such slights did, within the quiet confines of Elias's mind. He had long ago mastered the art of impassivity, his face a placid mask that revealed little of the tumultuous emotions often raging beneath. But the words, immovable utility, had struck a particularly raw nerve. It wasn't just about his job, it was about his perceived essence, his very being reduced to a functional, unmoving object. Clara Beaumont observed Julian's cruel display from across the hall. She was a patron of the Gilded Lyre, a woman whose discerning eye and quiet elegance made her a prominent, yet unobtrusive, presence at most major events. Her hair, a meticulously styled silver blonde, framed a face etched with the wisdom of 60 years. Her eyes, a keen shade of hazel, missed little. She had come tonight to hear the mezzo-soprano, but also, in truth, to find a moment of solace. Her own life, though outwardly successful, held a quiet ache, a sense of something beautiful lost, something yearned for but never quite attained. She understood, perhaps better than most, the subtle nuances of human pain, and the quiet courage it took to endure. Clara hadn't known Julian Thorne well, but she knew his type. The privileged young men who believed the world was their personal stage, and everyone else merely an extra in their self-serving drama. She had seen him mock the staff before, always with that chillingly polite sneer. But tonight, something about the security guard's quiet acceptance, the way his shoulders seemed to settle a little heavier, stirred a faint disquiet within her. She recognized the look in his eyes, brief as it was before he masked it, a flicker of profound hurt, quickly veiled by professional detachment. It was a look she had seen in the eyes of others, and sometimes in the mirror. Elias, oblivious to Clara's momentary observation, retreated further into his internal world. His coping mechanism was a well-worn path. He would focus on the details of his job, the intricate patterns of the antique Persian rug, the precise angle of a painting, anything to anchor himself in the present and away from the echoing taunts. He knew his life was simple, almost stark, compared to the lavish lives of the patrons he guarded. His apartment, a haven of quiet solitude, was filled not with expensive art, but with memories and the ghost of a grand piano that had long since been sold. The worn armchair by the window, where he often sat in the evenings, became his personal sanctuary, a place where he could finally shed the uniform of impassivity and allow himself to feel. He remembered the piano vividly, its polished mahogany gleaming under the soft light of his childhood home. His fingers, much smaller then, had traced its curves with reverence. Music had been his first language, his deepest joy. He'd excelled, showing a prodigious talent that had earned him scholarships, praise, and the unwavering belief of his parents. His mother, a woman with a voice as clear as a mountain spring, had taught him his first melodies, instilling in him a love for the soaring power of the human voice. His father, a quiet, hard-working man, had seen the fierce light in his son's eyes and spared no effort to nurture it. But life, in its unpredictable cruelty, had interceded. A sudden, devastating illness had struck his mother, followed by a crippling financial downturn that had slowly, relentlessly dismantled their small world. Elias, still in his early 20s, on the cusp of a promising career as a classical singer, had made the difficult, heart-wrenching choice. He'd sold the piano, his most cherished possession, along with other valuables, to pay for medical bills and to keep his family afloat. His dreams, once vibrant and full of possibility, had receded into the background, becoming hushed whispers that only he could hear. The weight of that decision, the quiet sacrifice, had settled upon him, not just in his soul, but in the very way he carried his body. The broad frame, the slight stoop, they were not merely physical attributes, but the outward manifestations of an inner burden, of dreams laid to rest. Clara, as she navigated the elegant throng, found her gaze drifting back to Elias. There was something in his stillness, a profound sense of containment that intrigued her. He wasn't merely a guard, he was a silent observer, a witness to the parade of humanity. She wondered what thoughts occupied his mind, what stories lay hidden behind those watchful eyes. She saw the heavy suit, the seemingly unremarkable exterior, and yet an intuition, born of years of studying human nature, told her there was more to Elias than met the eye. She felt a connection, a resonance with the quiet dignity she sensed beneath his uniform, a dignity that seemed to challenge the superficiality of the world around him. It was a feeling she couldn't quite articulate, a subtle pull towards a story waiting to be told. The gilded lyre, with its soaring ceilings and whispering marble, felt like a grand cage, trapping both its treasures and its unacknowledged guardians. Elias was just one of many, but to Clara, in that fleeting moment, he seemed to encapsulate the quiet suffering of all who felt undervalued, invisible. The contrast between his understated presence and the opulent setting was stark, a silent indictment of a society that often judged worth by outward appearance and material wealth, completely missing the profound depths that lay beneath. Chapter 3. The following weeks unfolded with an almost predictable rhythm of quiet observation for Elias and increasing antagonism from Julian. Julian, emboldened by the lack of direct challenge to his previous remarks, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in subtly undermining Elias's presence. He would orchestrate elaborate entrances and exits, often requiring Elias to open doors or stand aside, always accompanied by a dismissive wave or a whispered comment to his companions about the reliability of the silent service industry. Elias bore it all with a practiced grace, his inner world a fortress against the onslaught. But each cut, however small, chipped away at the edges of his resilience. Clara, a frequent visitor to the Gilded Lyre for its diverse cultural offerings, found herself unconsciously monitoring these interactions. She noticed the way Elias's hand would clench imperceptibly when Julian delivered a particularly barbed slight, or the almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw. Her initial fleeting curiosity had deepened into a quiet sympathy, a growing sense of injustice. She saw a quiet strength in Elias's refusal to react, a dignity that Julian, for all his inherited status, seemed utterly incapable of possessing. She recognized the immense self-control required to absorb such casual cruelty without outward sign, a strength born, she suspected, from a lifetime of similar trials. One particularly blustery evening, the Gilded Lyre was hosting a lavish charity gala, an event overflowing with philanthropic luminaries, dazzling jewels, and an abundance of champagne. Elias was stationed near the grand ballroom, his presence a quiet anchor amidst the swirling chaos of high society. The air buzzed with excited chatter, the clink of glasses, and the faint, lilting strains of a live jazz band. Julian Thorne, predictably, was at the center of a boisterous group, animated by several flutes of champagne and the intoxicating atmosphere of self-congratulation. They had just come from a particularly loud discussion about a performance art piece, and Julian, catching sight of Elias, seemed to formulate a new, more audacious plan for entertainment. He sauntered over, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous, almost malicious light. "Ah, our stalwart guardian of the gates," he began, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of his inner circle. "Tell me, Elias, do you ever find yourself overcome by the sheer artistry of this place? Does the music, the painting, the very spirit of creation ever move you to expression?" He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep over Elias's unassuming form. One imagines a life spent merely observing, never participating, must be rather unfulfilling. Elias maintained his professional demeanor, his gaze steady. "My role is observation, sir, and protection." Julian let out, "Such dedication! But surely even a man of such utility must harbor some hidden depths, a secret passion, a dormant talent?" He took a sip of champagne, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We've been discussing the nature of performance, you see, the raw, unfiltered truth of human expression, and it occurred to me," he gestured vaguely at Elias, "that perhaps our esteemed security guard has been holding out on us." A ripple of amused interest went through Julian's group. One young woman, clad in a sequined gown, giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Julian pressed on, the dare forming in his mind, sharp and cruel. "Tell you what, Elias, the band is taking a break. The stage, for a fleeting moment, is empty. Why don't you show us that hidden truth you clearly possess? Serenade us, perform, do something, anything that proves you are more than just a uniform." His tone was mocking, laced with an undeniable challenge. A song, perhaps, a dramatic monologue about the existential angst of a security guard. Anything to elevate you from your assigned station, if only for a few minutes. He swept his hand towards the stage, a grand, dismissive gesture. Go on, impress us, show us the art within the immovable utility. The words hung in the air, thick with their contempt. It was no longer a subtle slight. It was an open humiliation, a demand for Elias to expose himself for ridicule. The challenge was designed to fail, to prove Julian's point, that Elias was indeed nothing more than his physical form, nothing more than the uniform. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, a cold dread washing over him. The stage, with its expectant silence, suddenly seemed to loom like a gaping maw. Chapter 4. The dare, raw and humiliating, reverberated through Elias's mind, each word a chisel chipping away at his composure. The jazz band had indeed paused, the stage lights dimmed, leaving a hushed anticipation in the room. All eyes, it seemed, were fixed on him, a silent chorus awaiting his public mortification. He felt a dizzying surge of panic, a longing to simply vanish, to melt into the opulent wallpaper. But something deeper, a stubborn ember of pride, refused to let him flee. As the opulent room blurred at the edges, a vivid memory surged forward, enveloping him, pulling him back decades. He was no longer Elias, the stoic security guard. He was Eli, a slender boy of 17, his fingers flying across the ivory keys of a grand piano in a small, dimly lit practice room. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and rosin, the distant sounds of an orchestra tuning, a symphony of anticipation. He was at the National Conservatory of Music, a scholarship student, a prodigious talent whose baritone voice had already begun to turn heads. His mentor, Professor Petrov, a man whose stern exterior belied a profound empathy, had recognized in Eli not just a voice, but a soul. "Your voice, Eli," Petrov had said, his accent thick. "It is a vessel for stories, for emotions too deep for words. Do not just sing the notes, live them." Eli had lived them. He poured his heart into every aria, every leader, every complex vocal exercise. He dreamed of the stage, of the grand opera houses, of a life steeped in the transcendent beauty of music. He remembered particularly one evening, practicing late, the moon a sliver outside the window. He was perfecting an aria from Verdi's Otello, the powerful, tragic Credo in un Dio crudel. His voice, though still maturing, resonated with an astonishing depth, filling the room with both fury and despair. He had been so lost in the music that he hadn't heard her enter, Ilara. Her name, even now, was a whisper of bittersweet memory. She was a fellow student, a soprano with a voice like spun silver and eyes that held the sparkle of distant stars. She had leaned against the doorframe, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "Magnificent, Eli," she had whispered, her voice soft, "but perhaps a little too much darkness for such a beautiful soul." He had flushed, embarrassed yet thrilled by her presence. Ilara was his confidant, his muse, his quiet, burgeoning love. They spent countless hours together, sharing dreams, practicing duets, their voices intertwining in a delicate dance of harmony and hope. He remembered her hands, small and graceful on his arm, as they walked through the autumn leaves, discussing composers, their futures, their intertwined destinies. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the scent of her lilac perfume, the way her laughter would bubble up, bright and effervescent. They had planned to audition for a prestigious opera company in Europe, a shared dream, a future shimmering with possibility. They were young, full of passion, and utterly convinced that music would be the unwavering core of their lives.
But the world outside the conservatory walls was harsh and unyielding. The first blow had been his father's sudden illness, a debilitating stroke that left him unable to work. Then came the devastating diagnosis for his mother, a rare, aggressive form of cancer that devoured their savings, their peace, their hope. Eli, the eldest, saw his family teetering on the brink of ruin. The scholarship covered tuition, but not the mounting medical bills, not the household expenses, not the younger siblings who depended on him. He remembered the agonizing night he told Ilara. They sat in their usual cafe, the steam from their teacups mingling with the autumn chill. His voice had been choked with unshed tears, confessing the impossible choice before him. He had to leave the conservatory. He had to work. The dream, the shared future, was shattering into a million iridescent pieces. Ilara had listened, her face pale, her own eyes brimming. "But Eli," she had whispered, "your voice, your gift, you cannot abandon it." "I have no choice, Ilara," he had replied, the words tasting like ash. "My family needs me, now. Music is a luxury we cannot afford." He still remembered the way her hand trembled as she reached for his, a silent plea. He remembered the pain of that conversation, the way he had felt his soul being torn in two. He remembered the desperate embrace, the tearful farewell. She had gone on to Europe, pursuing their shared dream, while he had stayed, his heart heavy, his future irrevocably altered. He had taken on grueling jobs, manual labor at first, then anything that paid, slowly, inexorably, accumulating the physical burdens that now defined his outer shell. His voice, his instrument, had fallen silent, used only in the solitary moments of his private despair. The weight of his sacrifice had etched itself onto his physical form, the strong shoulders, now slightly stooped, carrying not just the years, but the immense burden of a deferred dream. The elegance of a musician's posture had been replaced by the weary solidity of a man who carried the world on his back. The memory, so vivid, so raw, was a torrent of past pain and profound loss. It was why Julian's words, immovable utility, struck so deep. Because he had once been anything but. He had been fluid, expressive, full of music. But life had molded him into something else, something solid, something stoic, a shell of what he once was, yet still holding the essence of that younger, passionate self. Chapter 5. Julian's laughter, sharp and dismissive, sliced through Elias's waking reverie, yanking him back to the present. The dazzling lights of the Gilded Lyre, once a beacon of lost dreams, now felt like an interrogation lamp. The crowd, a shimmering mosaic of faces, watched him with varying degrees of curiosity and scorn. The jazz band leader, an older man with kind eyes, offered Elias a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent warning perhaps, or a plea for him not to succumb to the humiliation. But Julian was relentless, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's wrong, guard? Stage fright? Perhaps you need a little encouragement." He turned to a waiter passing by with a tray of champagne. "Fetch our friend here something to loosen him up. Perhaps a glass of water. Wouldn't want him to burst into song and then faint from exertion. After all, standing for hours is quite the feat, isn't it?" His mockery was now thinly veiled, designed to draw more laughter from his sycophantic audience. Clara Beaumont, observing from a discreet distance, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Julian's performance was deplorable. She watched Elias, seeing the subtle tremor in his hand, the way his jaw muscles flexed, betraying the immense effort it took for him to remain outwardly composed. She remembered the fleeting sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes before, and now understanding began to dawn. This man was not merely an object of ridicule. He was a man being deliberately tormented, a private sorrow being publicly exploited.
There was a quiet dignity about him that Julian's relentless barbs could not entirely erase, and Clara found herself increasingly drawn to it, a silent witness to a profound injustice. The flashback, though momentarily interrupted, pulsed beneath Elias's consciousness. The memory of Ilara, of their intertwined dreams, was a ghost in the grand hall. He could almost hear her silvery voice echoing through the opulent space, a haunting counterpoint to Julian's sneering challenge. The sheer audacity of Julian's dare to demand expression from him was a cruel irony, for expression had been the very core of his being, ripped away by the unyielding demands of survival. He remembered the bitter winter nights, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, his hands raw, his body aching. The exhaustion had been bone deep, leaving no room for music, no energy for the delicate artistry he once commanded. He had felt his vocal cords tighten, unused, unexercised, the beautiful instrument of his body slowly becoming a vessel for labor, for endurance, for quiet suffering. The once supple muscles of a singer had gradually become the robust, somewhat heavy frame of a man who carried heavy loads, both literal and figurative. The gilded lyre itself, usually a place of quiet professional vigilance for Elias, now seemed to mock him with its grandeur. The stage, with its rich velvet curtains and polished wooden floor, whispered of countless performances, of soaring voices and masterful instrumentation. A magnificent Steinway grand piano sat majestically to one side, its lid open, its keys gleaming under the stage lights, a silent, powerful invitation. Its presence was a cruel taunt to Elias, a reminder of the instrument he had once loved, the music he had been forced to abandon. The perfect acoustics of the hall, designed to carry every nuance of sound to the furthest corner, suddenly felt like a trap, ensuring that any faltering note, any tremble in his voice would be amplified for all to hear. Julian, sensing Elias's hesitation, mistook it for capitulation. He grinned, a triumphant, unpleasant curve of his lips. "Ha ha ha, I see. A man of many secrets, but perhaps no grand revelations. Pity. We were hoping for a show, something truly memorable. But I suppose some are destined to merely hold the ropes, while others command the stage, eh?" He nudged one of his friends, who snickered. The words "hold the ropes" were the final, crushing blow. Elias felt a sudden, fierce anger ignite within him, a spark of defiance that had long been dormant. It wasn't just about Julian anymore. It was about the ghost of Ilara, about Professor Petrov, about the boy he once was, brimming with talent and dreams. It was about the injustice of a world that so readily dismissed a man based on his outer casing, oblivious to the vibrant, beating heart within. He had sacrificed everything, stifled his very essence for his family. And now, this entitled young man, who had likely never known a bit
of true hardship, dared to dismiss his entire being. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within Elias. The shame, the humiliation, coalesced into a fierce resolve. He would not be broken. He would not let this boy, this embodiment of all he resented about this superficial world, define him. He would not stand by and allow his deepest, most painful truth to be trampled underfoot. The stage, with its silent, gleaming piano, ceased to be a place of terror and transformed into a battlefield, a sanctuary, a pulpit from which his long-silenced voice would finally rise. He would accept the dare, but he would do it on his own terms. He straightened his broad shoulders, a subtle but distinct movement that Clara noticed immediately, a silent declaration of war. The weary stoop seemed to lessen, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. The uniform, once a symbol of his humble station, now felt like a chrysalis ready to shed. Chapter 6. A hush, thick with anticipation and a touch of malice, fell over Julian's group as Elias, with a slow, deliberate movement, began to walk towards the stage. The rhythmic clack of his polished security shoes against the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Each step was a defiance, a reclamation. The oppressive weight of the uniform, the years of quiet servitude, seemed to fall away with every stride. Clara watched, mesmerized, a flicker of hope igniting within her. She sensed a profound shift, a quiet courage emerging from the depths of a man long accustomed to invisibility. Julian, momentarily stunned by Elias's unexpected acceptance of the challenge, quickly recovered, a smirk replacing his initial surprise. "Well, well, the guard decides to entertain us after all," he drawled, his voice laced with patronizing amusement. "Let's hope his performance is as sturdy as his presence." His companions snickered, their eyes fixed on Elias, expecting a spectacle of awkwardness, a confirmation of their snobbish superiority. Elias reached the edge of the stage, paused for a beat, then ascended the few steps with a new, almost regal bearing. He moved towards the gleaming Steinway grand piano, his heavy suit seeming to shed its bulk with each step. His hands, usually clasped behind his back or holding a clipboard, now seemed to move with a latent grace as he approached the instrument. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he reached out, his calloused fingertips gently brushing the polished wood of the piano's lid, a gesture of profound reverence, as if touching a long-lost friend. The audience, initially buzzing with whispers and low chuckles, began to quiet. There was something in Elias's demeanor, a quiet intensity that commanded attention. Clara leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in her throat. She saw a flicker of something ancient and powerful in his eyes, a depth that belied his humble exterior. Elias slowly pulled out the piano bench and sat down. He settled his broad frame, his hands hovering over the keys for a moment, an almost sacred pause. The grand piano, once a symbol of his lost dreams, now felt like an extension of his very soul. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. In that moment, the opulent hall, Julian's mocking gaze, the judging eyes of the crowd, all faded. There was only Elias, the piano, and the profound silence waiting to be filled. Then, his fingers, surprisingly nimble and delicate despite their outward ruggedness, descended upon the keys. The first notes were soft, hesitant almost, a tender, melancholic arpeggio that seemed to search for something lost. It was a melody Elias had composed years ago, a silent lament for his shattered dreams, a private elegy for Alara and the music they had once shared. The simple, raw beauty of the notes filled the room, a stark contrast to the sophisticated jazz that had played earlier. It was unadorned, deeply personal, and utterly captivating. A murmur rippled through the audience. This was not the clumsy fumbling they had expected. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered confusion. The delicate arpeggio built, gaining a quiet strength, a subtle harmonic complexity. Elias's posture, initially a little stiff, began to relax. His shoulders, once stooped, now squared, his head held higher. The uniform, for a moment, seemed to become invisible, the man beneath it emerging, unbound. Then Elias opened his mouth, and a sound emerged that silenced every whisper, every murmur, every lingering doubt. It was a voice unlike anything they had expected, a rich, resonant baritone, deep and warm, yet imbued with an astonishing clarity and emotional resonance. It began as a low, almost guttural hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his being, a sorrowful echo of a forgotten lament. Then, with a slow, deliberate crescendo, it rose, pure and powerful, filling the vast hall with a raw, undeniable beauty. He didn't sing an opera aria, not yet. He sang an old folk song, a lament about loss and enduring hope, a melody that spoke of weathered hands and tireless spirits, of quiet sacrifices made in the shadows. His voice was not technically flawless in the pristine, polished way of the mezzo-soprano from earlier, but it was something far more profound. It was raw, imbued with the grit of lived experience, the ache of unspoken grief, the quiet strength of resilience. Each note was weighted with emotion, a story told not just through lyrics, but through the very texture of his voice, through the subtle vibrato that spoke of a heart that had known both immense joy and crushing sorrow. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. The voice resonated within her, stirring emotions she had long suppressed. It was the sound of a truth finally unleashed, a soul laid bare. She saw not Elias the security guard, but Elias the artist, a man whose physical form was merely a vessel for an astonishing, profound beauty. His hands, still playing the piano with tender precision, seemed to draw the music from the very air, weaving it into a tapestry of sound that enveloped the entire room. The sheer audacity of his voice, the unvarnished honesty of his performance was breathtaking. Julian stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. The snickering of his friends had died out, replaced by an uneasy silence, then by expressions of genuine awe. The carefully constructed facade of their superficial world was crumbling under the weight of Elias's raw, undeniable talent. The man they had mocked, the immovable utility, was revealing a truth so profound, so unexpected, that it rendered them speechless, stripped of their power and their contempt. Chapter 7. Elias's voice soared, a powerful, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the gilded lyre. He had finished the folk song, but the raw wellspring of emotion, once dammed, now flowed freely. Without pausing, his fingers shifted, moving with an instinctive, almost muscle memory grace into the opening chords of an Italian aria. It was not the tragic credo from his youth, but rather Umbra mai fu from Handel's Circe, a tender, reflective ode to the shade of a plane tree, a song of peace, of beauty, of quiet contemplation. Yet, in Elias's interpretation, it became much more. An elegy for lost serenity, a prayer for enduring grace amidst life's storms. His voice, so unexpectedly powerful, was a revelation. It possessed a richness, a depth, and an emotional honesty that transcended mere vocal technique. Each note was shaped with an exquisite tenderness, a profound understanding of the human heart. The initial rawness had given way to a sublime control, a masterful blend of power and vulnerability. The decades of silence had not diminished his instrument. Instead, they had imbued it with a gravitas, a seasoned wisdom that a younger, less experienced singer could never possess. The slight tremor in his voice, rather than a flaw, was a testament to the emotional intensity of his performance, a whisper of the journey he had undertaken. The audience was utterly transfixed. The opulent hall, usually alive with chatter and movement, was now held in a profound, almost sacred silence. Faces, once etched with boredom or amusement, were now softened by wonder, some by genuine emotion. Tears welled in the eyes of several women, their own unspoken sorrows finding resonance in Elias's profound expression. The music bypassed the intellect and went straight to the heart, a language understood by all, regardless of social standing or wealth. Clara felt tears stream down her own cheeks, unbidden and unstoppable. The melody was achingly beautiful, but it was Elias's voice, his very presence, that shattered her composure. She saw the man, his eyes closed in concentration, his brow furrowed, his broad chest rising and falling with each powerful, controlled breath. She no longer saw the heavy suit, the stooped shoulders, the immovable utility. She saw the passion, the profound artistry that had been hidden, suppressed for so long. She saw the years of sacrifice, the quiet
Suffering, the immense, unshakable dignity of a soul that had endured. She understood in that moment that true beauty, true strength lay not in outward perfection or material wealth, but in the resilience of the human spirit, in the capacity to create beauty even from the ashes of broken dreams. The transformation in her view was complete. From initial indifference to a stirring of sympathy, then to profound respect, and now to overwhelming awe. She felt a deep, almost maternal ache for the young man he must have been, the dreams he had sacrificed, and an equally profound admiration for the man he had become, one who had, against all odds, rediscovered his voice. Julian Thorne, standing a few feet away, was utterly obliterated by the performance. His initial smirk had vanished entirely, replaced first by shock, then by a slow, creeping horror. His face was pale, his jaw slack. The laughter, the condescension, the casual cruelty he had wielded so effortlessly had been not just silenced, but utterly annihilated by the sheer force of Elias's talent. The realization that he had so profoundly misjudged, so cruelly mocked a man of such immense gifts was a humiliation far greater than any he could have inflicted. He had sought to make Elias look foolish, and instead Elias had, without saying a single word of rebuttal, exposed Julian's own shallow, cruel nature for all to see. The elegant room, which had always affirmed his position, now felt like a giant mirror reflecting his own inadequacy. Elias, lost in the music, poured out his heart. He wasn't singing for Julian, or for the crowd, or even for Clara. He was singing for Alara, for his parents, for the young man whose dreams had been deferred, for every unspoken regret and every enduring hope. He was singing for himself, for the reclaiming of a forgotten part of his soul. As the final lingering note of Ombre My Fou faded, suspended in the air like a precious crystal, the silence in the hall was absolute, profound. It was a silence heavier than any applause, a testament to the deep emotional impact of his performance. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, tentatively, a single clap echoed through the vast space. It was Clara. Her hands, delicate and trembling, met in a soft, resonant sound. That single clap was a signal. It broke the spell of stunned silence, and then a wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing into a thunderous roar, erupted through the gilded lyre. People rose from their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes, their faces glowing with a shared cathartic emotion. The applause was not just for the beautiful singing, it was for the unexpected revelation, for the triumph of spirit, for the courage to stand nakedly, emotionally, before a judging world. It was an acknowledgement of the profound truth that had just been unveiled. Elias opened his eyes. He saw the blur of standing figures, heard the deafening roar of appreciation. He saw Clara, her face radiant, her eyes still wet, offering him a genuine, heartfelt smile of profound respect and admiration. And then his gaze found Julian. The young man stood slumped against a pillar, his face ashen, his previous arrogance utterly stripped away, leaving only a raw, exposed shame. In that moment, Elias felt no triumph over Julian, only a quiet, resolute peace. The antagonist was humbled, not by Elias's will, but by the undeniable power of his truth. The uniform, once his prison, now felt like a discarded husk, a forgotten shell from which a profound and beautiful truth had finally emerged. Chapter 8. The roar of applause continued, a wave of human emotion crashing over Elias. He stood by the piano, his chest still heaving slightly from the exertion, the echoes of his song still vibrating in the air and in his very bones. For a moment, he simply allowed himself to be present, to absorb the overwhelming tide of appreciation. It was a sensation he had long forgotten, a resonance with the audience that was the lifeblood of any performer, and it filled a void he hadn't realized was so vast. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Elias bowed his head, a gesture of profound humility and gratitude. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd, no longer seeing them as a mass of judging eyes, but as individuals whose hearts he had touched. He saw genuine emotion, respect, and a shared connection that transcended the social barriers of the room. Clara, her heart still thrumming with the emotional power of his performance, pushed through the crowd, her gaze fixed on Elias. She felt an urgent need to speak to him, to offer more than just applause. As she approached the stage, a path seemed to clear for her, as if the crowd instinctively recognized the sincerity of her intent. Elias met her gaze as she reached the foot of the stage. Her eyes, still shining with unshed tears, held a depth of understanding and admiration that warmed him from the inside out. He saw no pity, no condescension, only profound respect. "That was astonishing, Elias," Clara said, her voice husky with emotion. "Truly breathtaking, a gift." She didn't offer platitudes. Her words were simple, deeply felt, and entirely genuine. Elias offered her a small, gentle smile, a warmth radiating from his eyes that had been absent for decades. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his voice still resonant but softened now by emotion. The director of the Gilded Lyre, a stately woman named Mrs. Albright, who had rushed back into the hall after hearing the commotion, now stood beside Clara, her face a mixture of shock and fervent excitement. "Elias!" she exclaimed, her voice barely containing her astonishment. "I had no idea. Your voice, it's magnificent. How could you have kept such a talent hidden?" Before Elias could answer, a man from the audience, a renowned music critic known for his sharp wit and even sharper pen, stepped forward. "Indeed, a voice of such power and purity is a rarity. Mr. Thorne, your challenge has unearthed a true jewel." His words, though directed at Julian, were a clear endorsement of Elias, a public acknowledgment of his artistic merit. Julian Thorne remained rooted to his spot, his face still pale, his arrogance completely deflated. He watched, utterly diminished, as the very people he had sought to impress now lauded the man he had ridiculed. He had nothing to say, no retort, no sneering comment. His world, built on superficial judgments, had been shattered by the profound truth of Elias's voice. The silence he offered was his only and most honest apology. Elias, however, felt no desire to gloat. He simply stood tall, his gaze now firm and steady. "I had a dream once," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the now hushed hall, "a dream for a life in music. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Family, duty, they called louder. And so the music became a private solace, a whisper in the dark." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the faces, lingering on Clara's, then briefly touching Julian's. "I believed that part of me was lost, buried under years of responsibility. But tonight," he gestured vaguely to the piano, to the reverberating silence, "tonight you gave me back my voice." His honesty was disarming, imbued with a quiet strength that resonated deeply with the audience. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a profound, heartfelt truth. Mrs. Albright, her professional instincts fully ignited, stepped forward. "Elias, this is an extraordinary gift. The Gilded Lyre would be honored to provide you a stage, to help you reclaim your artistry. We host evenings dedicated to emerging and rediscovered talents. We could arrange for you to perform properly, to share this with the world."
Offers began to ripple through the crowd, a music agent expressing keen interest, a wealthy patron offering to fund lessons, a renowned vocal coach offering her mentorship. Elias, who had come to work a security shift, was suddenly at the epicenter of a whirlwind of opportunity, a lifetime of suppressed dreams now bursting forth. But Elias, even in this moment of triumph, maintained his quiet agency. He wasn't just a passive recipient of these offers, he was the master of his own destiny. He looked at Mrs. Albright, then at Clara, and a genuine, unburdened smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and made them sparkle. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of a newfound lightness. "Thank you all. It seems the music was never truly lost. It was just waiting for the right moment to find its way home." He reached out, his hand gently touching the piano keys one last time, a silent promise to himself and to the music he had rediscovered. The man who had been defined by his
physical form, by his uniform, had finally stepped out of the shadows, revealing the profound, beautiful truth that lay within. The emotional climax was not just the performance, but this moment of graceful acceptance, this reclaiming of a life, a dream that had seemed irrevocably lost. He had not just sung, he had spoken, not with words of anger or recrimination, but with the eloquent language of his heart, transforming not only his own fate, but the perceptions of everyone in the room. Epilogue. Months blossomed into a year, each one painting a new chapter in Elias's transformed life. The Gilded Lyre, once a place of silent observation, had indeed become his stage. His voice, refined through careful coaching and diligent practice, had lost none of its raw, soul-stirring power. He performed regularly, sometimes solo, sometimes with small ensembles, always to sold-out houses. Critics lauded him as a rediscovered treasure, a voice that heals and inspires. His physical form, once a subject of mockery, was now seen not as a limitation, but as the embodiment of resilience, the strong, grounded vessel for a soaring spirit. The slight stoop had lessened, replaced by the confident posture of a performer, a man who carried his history not as a burden, but as a deep, rich foundation for his art. He had started a small foundation dedicated to helping aspiring musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring that no talent, no dream would be extinguished by the harsh realities of life, as his had almost been. He often spoke at these events, sharing his story with quiet dignity, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond the surface, of recognizing the inherent worth in every individual. Clara Beaumont became a steadfast patron, not just of the Gilded Lyre, but of Elias himself. She often attended his performances, her eyes alight with pride and a deep, empathetic understanding. They shared quiet conversations after concerts, discussing music, life, and the enduring power of human connection. Their friendship, forged in a moment of shared vulnerability and triumph, was a testament to the unexpected bonds that could form when one dared to truly see another. She had found in Elias's story a reflection of her own desire for deeper meaning, a reminder that the world held more beauty and resilience than its often superficial veneer suggested. Julian Thorne's transformation was a slower, more subtle one. The public humiliation had been a catalyst, stripping him of his complacent arrogance. He attended one of Elias's early performances, sitting in the very back, a quiet, almost spectral presence. Afterwards, he approached Elias, not with his usual sneer, but with a humble, almost hesitant apology. I was wrong, Elias," he had stammered, his eyes downcast. "Profoundly so. I judged you unfairly. I hope you can forgive my cruelty." Elias had simply nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. He offered no grand speech, no dramatic pronouncements, merely a gracious acceptance of the unexpected amends.
Julian began volunteering for the Gilded Liars outreach programs, gradually learning
the value of empathy and genuine contribution, his once sharp edges slowly softening. Elias's small apartment was now filled with music, not just from the grand piano he had finally been able to purchase, but from the instruments of young students he mentored. The echoes of Ilara's voice, once a melancholic whisper, now mingled with the hopeful voices of new talent, a sweet, harmonious chorus. His dreams, once broken and scattered, had been painstakingly pieced back together, forming a mosaic richer and more profound than he could have ever imagined. He had been mocked for his physical form, for the uniform he wore, for the perceived limitations of his station. But beneath the surface, under the stoic exterior, lay a truth so powerful, so beautiful, that it had reshaped his life and touched countless others. He had taken off his suit, not literally, but metaphorically, shedding the confines of others' judgments, revealing the hidden truth of his indomitable spirit and his magnificent, soaring voice. His story became a living testament to the fact that true worth lies not in what the eye can see, but in the unseen depths of the soul, in the resilience of the human heart, and in the enduring power of dreams, no matter how long deferred. Where are you watching from? Which part touched you most? Share below. Subscribe for stories that heal and inspire. Thank you for your time and kindness. Stay kind, stay brave.